Hello and welcome back to Parley. This one was paid for by vampbug. Hope you'll enjoy listening. What makes the virtual simulator of a tabletop game like a card game a video game, besides the system it's ran on? Is video game even a useful term? That's it. That's the parlay. That's the question. Well, it would do to start by talking about what even makes a term useful, what even is the purpose of the term. And then we can break down what is literally different with some examples. I also want to talk about the extent to which games have different strengths if they're in paper, I guess you could say, or if they're on an online client. Some examples of games that were made with those things in mind, with really no intention that they would become paper games. But of course, it isn't impossible to play them in paper, it's just awkward for various reasons. And we'll go from there. But I like this question. You know, it might sound on the surface like, what, what do you mean is video game a useful term? Like we gotta call them something, you know. But I don't know. I mean, I imagine that Vampbug probably heard. You've asked some tabletop role playing game questions before, and Vampug, you may have heard that Dungeons and Dragons is adding a virtual client tabletop version of their new version of the rules. And there's this bit where they insist that it is not a video game. They insist it's not a video game. It's a virtual whatever version of the thing. Which yeah. So I wonder if this was motivated by that. I would actually like to talk about that briefly. Let's use that as a place to start. So to get everyone on the same page, what this is you know your tabletop role playing game. You've got your character sheet. You got your 20-sided die with a pirate sunken treasure theme that everybody has. Everyone has that, and and you could, of course, put that on the internet. You could have the character sheet be, you know, on a web browser or whatever, which is what a lot of people did during COVID-19 and still do because it's more or less still COVID-19 forever. Um, and Yeah, so the idea is that they're making a first party one where the company making the Dungeons and Dragons rule books is making like a way to do it on the internet themselves, not just relying on the third party ones. And so the weirdness is they insist it isn't a video game. Now, why though? For this specific issue, I wonder if it's because they want to set people's expectations for um it being a having a story mode or something, like things like that. You are still required to make the game exist using this client, if I understand correctly. Although, weirdly, I suspect they probably will load their own modules and stuff into it, so I don't really know. That's a little bit weird. But maybe they're trying to say, you know, there's no thing to play unless you provide it yourself. We just made it a version of the tools. This is already a place where the term game, not necessarily video game, has kind of a confusion when you get Dungeons and Dragons rule books. Well, you have to create the game. You know, they if it's a module or like a campaign book, it might come with maps and stuff, but you need to, you know, make things that are not included. Well, actually, they do often include like character sheets and stuff. So is the distinction that this is just the tools for the rules for this game, not like the game? What even is the game in that case? Let's look at another example. You asked about card games. So when you buy Magic the Gathering cards, I mean you have to, you know the rules. It doesn't include a little slip that tells you the rules. Uh, you well, I mean some of them probably do, uh, but I don't know. And Obviously you have to, you know, kind of enforce the rules. But I mean, when you play Magic online, It basically is just providing you the materials, just like the D&D online thing. So what really makes those different? What makes that different? Again, I think I worry that people see, maybe the marketing people are worried that people are gonna see the marketing for the tabletop role playing game version and think, oh, it's like an isometric role playing game that is viewed from this one perspective, and then you move about the world and talk to NPCs, but then they'll buy it and it won't have like a built-in story mode or something. But again, it probably literally will, like in the sense that they'll have their own, but it doesn't just go. I don't know. I feel like that's what they're worried about in that moment. But you can see by digging into this subject that where you draw the line is pretty weird. Like I don't really know exactly how, the game just goes on its own. That doesn't really feel necessary. What about like competitive games? The meta game of a competitive game isn't necessarily a thing that's included with the game as per se. You could say that the things that motivate people to behave that way are included in the game. They're coded into the game, I guess. No, 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 no. Like, for example, in Duelist, you draw two cards per turn and you can replace a card every turn. Your hand size is six, and if you have a full hand, you don't draw more cards. If a card would be put in your hand and your hand is full, it's destroyed. It's a pretty strict hand size. Pretty small too for drawing six cards. For drawing two cards per turn. And obviously that doesn't force you to get the value out of your hand, to play in a way where you can get, enough stuff on the board or whatever. But you will probably play that way because the game contains enough motivations to push you to play that way that I would argue that is included as part of the game. To put it a different way, if I give you all the base rules for Dungeons and Dragons in a client, and also the structure for an entire campaign to run, and the game is that you run a role playing campaign, is that not a video game? Because I've given you the pieces where you will have the intended experience, sort of, like in the ballpark. It's not like there is no intended experience. You know what I'm trying to say? Not everybody will play Duelist like the way I described, but it doesn't mean that the game doesn't feature that gameplay. That is the character of Duelist. It's what almost all humans that are given enough time are encouraged to do with those parts. So I don't really think it's fair to say, I don't know, like if an invention is intuitive to most people but it doesn't include its instructions, is it like worse or something because it doesn't have that? I don't know. That's weird. So this is already more difficult than I thought, to be honest. But I think that that's a good starting point. It's a bit odd. Now that we've had that initial discussion, let's move on to literally just describing the differences between some games' physical and digital versions. There actually aren't that many examples that are close at hand, in the sense that many of them are like a little different virtually or were created originally virtually. In other words, the original version is digital, and then it's that's so accessible and it's so difficult logistically to make physical objects and distribute them and stuff that that's kind of gotten out of hand. So yeah, I Magic is really the one that comes to mind. So I guess we'll do that. So Magic the Gathering, the card game. Well, there aren't. It's not that there aren't a lot of starter products. There are way too many products in Magic. That's a whole thing. And I guess that's an initial difference, isn't it? You can buy Magic a lot of ways. And when you go to the digital client, if you play with the same cards, the game is the same. Put a pin in it. We'll come back to that. But you can't buy the cards. You can't get the cards the same way. This is actually blended with that point about the game is the same because it kind of isn't, and we'll get back to that. Uh, when I make a deck in paper, I go onto TCG Player and order all the singles and hit ship, and a package arrives at my door that is in a little envelope, and I take it out, and that is the deck, minus basic lands, which I have, and then I put it in card sleeves I bought, and like there you go. Like that's I've made the deck. That's not the only way I've ever made decks. You might go to a game store, you might trade cards, you might buy this pre-constructed product because it has enough cards in it when you looked up the deck list online that you will use in other things. So you buy the pre-constructed deck, immediately tear it apart for parts, you get it. But in on Magic Arena, for example, you cannot do that for the most part. You basically just buy packs or earn individual cards or get wild cards, which can be exchanged for any card of this same rarity. A system that really isn't replicated anywhere in paper magic. Like cards of the same rarity don't even remotely have similar value in paper magic. Not even close. Like a card being a rare is meaningless for its value. It could be anything. It could be a dime, or it could be $50. It means nothing about the card's value. And again, you just have way more options for ways to buy things. Even in Magic Online, Magic has two online clients, of course. So this is actually becoming a weird example, but what are you gonna do? There is a way to buy cards with like individual currency with tickets. And there are other weird wrinkles, like you can kind of rent a deck on Magic Online. That's something that what you could technically do physically. You could do on Magic Arena. You could rent someone's account that had a deck you wanted to play on it. You could do that thing in paper and on Arena, but it would be way more difficult, like or logistically in both cases. And in both cases, there's also more of a risk of theft. Like you can't kind of enforce the system as easily. Magic Online, I don't know that much about, but I do know that it features that. So you can see that some things are possible or much easier on each client. Sure. But I really want to stress that the big difference in my mind is actually the gameplay. On Magic Arena, the gameplay and Magic Online is enforced by the game mechanics. Like the game makes things work the way they're supposed to work. Well, it's supposed to anyway. And the game also shuffles. The game might shuffle more thoroughly than you, but importantly, the game also doesn't shuffle the same way you would shuffle. Magic Arena is actually notorious for kind of seeding your hand with a certain amount of land, which is sort of a weird thing. Now, in the defense of Magic Arena doing that, and maybe they don't still do that, by the way, I don't play Magic Arena anymore anyway. Magic Arena seeding your hand so you have the right amount of lands or whatever, or the right amount of lands, we'll come back to that. That's a big topic. Well, Magic is often played best of three, and you get to sideboard in between, which has a few purposes. It lets you adapt to what your opponents played, but it also lets you even out a little bit, getting like an unlucky draw, which a lot of deck building already seeks to even out. If your deck is really good, it's already done a lot to even that out. Mulliganing, recent mulliganing rules changes. The London Mulligan is, helps even that out quite a bit. But playing a few matches, not having it just be one match, is also a big thing. Now, Magic Arena, well, you don't do that by default. You get in the ladder queue and you play one game, and like there it is. Which has a whole bunch of problems and is part of why I don't play Magic Arena anymore. But yeah, seeding your hand with land that way is a whole thing. Really the differences I'm talking about though are things like the game is literally different in that one way, like the shuffler might do a thing on Magic Arena. But what I really mean is getting the rules wrong in paper, not knowing if a ruling is a certain way. It's incredibly common. Like almost every time I've played Magic with someone that I don't know, like when I play Magic publicly, you will hear someone confidently defend a nonsensical interpretation of how a card works. Now, I'm not trying to be rude when I say that. Like, it's okay if people don't understand cards mechanics. Magic has confusing rules. That's why you usually bring a judge or you have the online client. And often when you look up a card, it gives you some common rulings for that card as well. This is all very good. That's great. But it's very common for people to be really confident that their one, unbeknownst to them, I guess, very specific interpretation of the mechanics is like the only possible reading of those English words, which like it's not at all. That's ridiculous. But no offense, people are don't have a broad perspective. There is no time in life where people are taught to do that. So I find people are really quite bad at that. Even people who wouldn't enforce that their one interpretation, their one reading is the correct one, don't think of what the other ones would be easily. People are not good at this, in my experience. It's hard. Like it's a skill. It's my job, and so I think I am pretty good at this. When I read a card, I frequently have some quick questions, but I also have a lot of experience with Magic's rules and have even done some of the work to be a like a low level judge before. So I am usually not confused about what a card is meant to do, but at the same time, yeah, like that's a huge characteristic of tabletop play is that cards may not do exactly what they were intended to do, which can give cards a huge advantage sometimes. Or there might be rulings that are just unclear, and because it's a casual game and you can, rule the rules however you want, they're not going to enforce themselves. Oftentimes, a ruling is made just casually. Like, I could find out if that interaction works this way or that way, but we just don't care that much, and so we kind of let it work a certain way. Uh, that's common when playing casually. So that's another big difference too. I mean, another way of thinking of this is I'm curious how the Dungeons and Dragons tabletop first party thing is going to handle things like homebrew, which defines the gameplay of Dungeons and Dragons. The weird thing about Dungeons and Dragons is that it's a good example for this reason, I think, is that it's a game that isn't written intending it to be like a single code of rules that you can follow just as they're written. According to the game designers, anyway, the people who wrote the rules, they say we never intended there to be a single rules as written definition. You can say that's lip service or whatever, but reading the book, I've often made the point in Parley where people ask about D&D that there literally just isn't any protocol for the way things are worded. Like sometimes they word it like this, and many other times they word it several other ways. Like there really is no standard. You can tell reading the source material that it is clearly not written to be able to be used as like a code of rules. Magic cards, however, have you ever read a magic card, like a modern magic card? They're absolutely written as a strict code of rules that work a certain way. And I, with my experience with the game, could often tell you, like, oh, that's why they wrote it that weird way. Um, for example, I was teaching my partner the other day. She wanted to learn, and so we made decks and started playing. And I was teaching her about why a lot of cards provide like a space for something. Um, so, for example, she had an ability called scrying. You lift up the top some cards of your library, your deck. You look at them, you can rearrange them, and then you can put any number of them back on the top in any order or on the bottom in any order. So if you scry 3, you pick up the top 3 cards of your deck and you can manipulate them on the top or bottom of your library as you wish. You get to see them, your opponent doesn't, you can reorder them, whatever. It's good. Scrying more than 1 or 2 is super OP. That's awesome. But anyway, she had a scry 2 ability, and then it said draw a card. And she said, well, if I'm just going to keep these 2 on the top, can't I just put them in my hand? Like, why do I have to like put them back and then just draw the card like that I'm already holding? Why do I have to place it back down and then draw a card? And I said, well, maybe not in this case, but in many cases, the reason is that there has to be space for something to happen in between. Like when this was happening, it was during her upkeep, which is between when you untap all your stuff at the very beginning of your turn and when you draw for the turn. But the important thing is that you could do something in there. Like if I had a card that milled her, that took her cards off the top of her deck and put them in her graveyard, I can do that after the scry, but before the draw. So if she scries two and, says I'm putting both of them back on top, I go, okay, they're both good cards that she wants. Therefore, I will, before her draw step, play a card that makes her mill so that she doesn't draw those cards in between those two steps. So yeah, like there are several reasons why there's meant to be a step in between. Did they matter right now? No, like there's no cards in the deck I was playing that do that. But that's why the game is operated that way. And Magic has a lot of that stuff, like a lot of mental load, where there are steps that almost never matter but must be part of the game, or certain cards don't work a certain way, or like a lot of emergent complexity in Magic doesn't happen if we don't have those things. And hand waving that stuff, having that stuff be more loose, is a big characteristic of tabletop play. Whereas when you play on the mobile client, on Arena, you often are trying to play quickly, and it feels tedious that those steps are enforced, even though like there are times when it's required. Tools in these games, a pretty common one for Magic is you can kind of set a stop. So you can say, like, I'm planning to do something during your main phase two. I can click a button on the client that says, hey, game, alert me at their main phase two, but I'm not going to do anything until then. So don't make me click, like, I pass priority, I pass priority, I pass priority. I'm not doing anything, I'm not doing anything, I'm not doing anything. A million times, you're going to have to do that like 6 times. And then you get to their main phase two when you do want to do something. You can kind of like skip through all of those. But when you're playing in paper, there would really be no need to do that if you're playing casually. Again, competitively, you have to enforce that yourself because you need to give your opponent all those chances to do the thing. And if they say something like, "Oh, just wake me up when it's your main phase two," obviously they're giving you a lot of information. That kind of skip can only really work when the opponent doesn't see that you're waiting till that point, right? You can't, if it's physically, then they'll be like, okay, he's planning to do something during my main phase two. I'll just change everything so that doesn't work. So there is a big difference. I do think there's a big difference in the way the game feels. There will often be a difference in the rules of the game, the mechanics of the game. Uh, there is a big difference in what kind of mechanics you'd want to develop for each type of game. I actually think this ended up being a small point, so I'll summarize it quickly. But obviously, things like if an effect in a game is going to transform what is on a card, like change a card's text, that might be hard to do in paper. In a way, it's pretty easy to do in a digital client. Of course, you can do it. You could get dry erase cards, or like use a proxy card, or you people with a good memory, you just say, this card has become this thing. Um, and Magic has actually done a lot of stuff like that. There was a set where they wanted to permanently add keyword abilities to cards. They wanted to make that a thing they could do. So in the booster packs, there were cardboard inserts where you could punch out little, not in the booster packs, somewhere in the set, in commander decks or something, somewhere, there were little cardboard inserts where you could punch out little tokens that said like flying or death touch or like abilities, and then put them on your card as a way to indicate like that card gained that ability. Of course, it was a token as well, a counter that we call them in Magic. And so it can interact with things that interact with counters. You remove a counter from something, it's a flying counter, not just giving the creature flying permanently. So it had that little emergent mechanic awkwardness as well. That from an immersion perspective, I'm not really sure what you're doing there. But anyway, why can you take off the creature's ability to fly to pay a cost? But anyway, whatever, a topic for another time. My point is, of course, you can do it, but yeah. And I think that the example with Dungeons and Dragons is a good one for, it's not like Magic where I think ideally you would enforce the rules strictly. Although you can see from my example in Magic that enforcing the rules and all the steps strictly does have negatives. Like there are downsides to doing that. It's unnecessarily slow if it's not a serious situation. like if you're not playing for like money or whatever, you're just playing with a friend, the game flows more organically, provided everybody knows how the steps work and you're just acting in good faith. But Dungeons and Dragons takes it a step further, where you need to make homebrew rulings. You need to add rules, really. Even people that don't think they add rules do. You can't play D&D without adding rules. I will die on the hill of that idea. If anyone ever tells you like we're just running it the way the book runs it, you should be on alert to figure out what things they're doing that like the book doesn't contain complete usable rules. You can't do that. They're interpreting something, and you should keep an eye out for what it is. Which is like that's fine. You're supposed to interpret something, but they should just admit that everyone is interpreting something. Um, yeah. So my point is that when you make that into a digital client, basically making it more strict, that isn't necessarily good. Like it's kind of a core part of D&D that you are able to change the rules somewhat. D&D is a tricky one. Like one of the problems with D&D from a game design perspective is that it is a game that is defined by having a lot of rulings, but which cannot all be taken strictly. Like there is no code by which you can discern a single correct reading, yet the game does contain many single lines of text explaining what a thing like is supposed to do, which is bad. You would want either there are defined rules and they are clearly encoded so they can be used as a single rule, or you take the approach that there aren't as clearly defined rules. Either this spell generates a lot of rope. How much rope? You figure it out. It's what's a practical amount of rope for the spell to make? What are the implications for this world's economy if you can make this amount of rope? Like, you decide. Or this is a third level spell that takes this amount of time to cast and uses these parts of your body, or you need to say this word to cast the spell, and it makes exactly 10 feet of rope, and the ends of the rope are not singed, so they'll fray unless you burn them, and da 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 da, like those specifics. And Dungeons and Dragons does not do either of those things. It's a little bit closer to being the latter of the two, but it doesn't really commit to either thing. There are many cases where it'll say things like the one I always infamously say is armor proficiency is medium, but then in parentheses it says druids will not wear metal armor. And it's like, okay, well, most of the armor that's written down seems like it would contain metal. A breastplate would contain metal. But elsewhere in the game, if a class is only able to use like not all simple weapons, just staves and clubs, then the game just writes staves and clubs, not simple weapons, parentheses, you can only use staves and clubs, or you can't use short swords or metal weapons. But in that one place and nowhere else in D&D in 5th edition, they just don't write it that way and instead write that line. Again, there will be plenty of people who feel like, well, it says they can't, they won't wear, and won't is different than can't, metal armor, therefore they just can't wear metal armor. But my point is, if you're going to have that be a strict rule, you would write strict rulings, like strict wording that can be used and codified, rather than changing the way it's worded every single time. And you might say, like, can't and won't, Zandy, that doesn't matter. But why write it that way then? Like, why not just, like, obviously you would just, if you've ever written rules for anything ever before, then you would obviously not write it that way. And the reason, according to the game designers, is that they don't intend you to use it as a strict ruling. But the problem is that the game is structured in a way you would structure a game full of strict rulings, yet it just isn't purposefully, I guess, isn't written to actually have strict rulings. That's just bad game design, but whatever. It's not necessarily because of game design. It's because the D&D has too much baggage. But the point I'm trying to make is that being able to change the things in the game favors some types of games. And you might be surprised to hear this, but that actually is the point I'm going to make about what a video game is. You might be thinking, Zandy, it's been 30 minutes and you didn't talk basically at all about what a video game is, but we actually did. I'm going to read the question again. What makes the virtual simulator of a tabletop game, like a card game, a video game? Besides the system it's ran on, is video game a useful term? So here's what I think. I think that the reason that the card game version of, Magic the Gathering feels like a video game, I guess, where the virtual simulator of Dungeons and Dragons feels like there's some strange difference between the two. Even though it kind of feels like when I dug into it at the beginning, there is no clear difference really. It feels like there is some kind of imperceptible difference there. I think the reason is the open-endedness. I think that what defines a video game in the current moment, to the extent that it would feel like there's a meaningful difference, is that it is strict. I think it's that it's strict. I think the thing that makes the Magic Arena version a video game is that it's very strict, and I mean run on a digital client. Obviously, now we have to have the annoying discussion about like what even like terms have different types of uses. So we'll get it out of the way quickly. But this is stuff like a term could have many different purposes. Like video game doesn't have to be only what the thing is physically, or like only for marketing or whatever. Terms have lots of uses. I think what makes a term good is basically that it has purity of purpose, that there is a single thing it's trying to do, and it achieves that thing. Or it's the term is general and it embraces that generality. So, for example, I think video game is a very general term, and it mostly embraces that generality. Like the D&D example is weird, but there are very few other examples of that. There just aren't that many games that have that problem the same way that D&D does. There aren't that many games in general. So saying that this is a game and it's just on video works for almost all current game design. I will briefly note that it wouldn't necessarily work for all possible game design. You could design way more games where you add sort of interpretability into the game. But a lot of those games actually do pretty well transitioning over to being video games. For example, things like charades. There are, or like pictograms, Pictionary. I don't know. Anyway, you could play Jackbox games, on your phone, and you put it on a TV or a monitor that the whole group can see, and you can play those games that way. Very much the same as how you'd play them if you bought like a board game version. It works fine, even though a lot of the like fun of the game is from the players. And I think the difference is that those games structure, like the flow of the game, is strict. It's because that game, even when it isn't a video game, is strict, and therefore, if you transition it to being a video game, it works pretty well. I've often fantasized about how it would be fun to have a sort of artificial intelligence judge presiding over a game that I played. And if I tried to do something in a video game, excuse me, that I clearly got it, and I just like fat fingered something or whatever, and the challenge of this game is meant to be about my thinking, not about my mechanical skill, the sort of AI judge would say, oh, like even though the strict rules of the game say you fail, you really should see, like it's the intention of this experience that you'd succeed given that you thought that. So I'll make you succeed. Like I'll change the rules so you succeed. Does that make sense? Basically, adding a game master from a tabletop role playing game to your video game to interpret it and make it less strict when it makes the experience better, or when the strictness doesn't make the game better. Um, and I think that is a problem for this definition, I suppose, where it feels like the things that work as video games are kind of strict. But at the moment, basically, it's just like if it's game design and it's on a computer, then it's a video game, and I think that's fine. I don't think there's a lot of problems there. Um, I think the weirdness is in that that wiggle room, that strictness of open-ended game design. And I think the reason why that's weird and why there isn't a lot of game design that isn't quote strict, as I'm calling it, is because to make game design not strict is to require players of the game to be game designers to a small degree. And that's probably why I uh, am so dicey about how like most people play D&D, because I don't think most people make good game designers. And I don't think that you can play most tabletop role playing games if you are not a game designer. This goes away quickly if you play a stricter one. I remember playing, what's that one called? Betrayal of the House on the Hill? Not really, but that's a fine example too. But that's there's not as much of a role playing element. You can make a tabletop role playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, but make the rulings very strict, and suddenly this problem largely disappears. Like there isn't as much of a need, but it also doesn't have the same flavor. I don't think. If you made a game, it's funny because people really hold up being able to interpret D&D's rules one strict way. There being a correct ruling that is rules as written, that is how it was intended. There really isn't that thing most of the time, but a lot of people really hold on to that, which is funny because if you played a game that actually had that, I think it would be really easy to notice the difference. The texture of playing that game would change a lot. There wouldn't be as much discussion about the thing, or I think a big character about D&D, about playing D&D, is that you often just let something be a way that is more fair. Again, you are the kind of AI judge I described, and you often say, "Look, I think it's just more reasonable if we do it this way." Even though, like, the who cares about the ruling? It doesn't matter. I want to be fair to you, and that type of human kindness is, I think, a big feature of that type of game. And in Magic too, absolutely. The elephant in the room for games like that is saying, you know what, you're a new player, or like you've just been getting a lot of unlucky draws, and we're not like playing for a score or something. Like you don't, we're not. There's no stakes, material stakes riding on this match. So just draw another hand of 7 cards. You don't have to go down a card as the rules dictate. Friend of mine that we're playing in the comfort of our own home, like just draw a new hand. It's fine. Like stuff like that. Or you're teaching a new player and you literally just stack the deck so they get certain cards at sensible times. Stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's the strictness, I guess, that I feel like defines it. I thought the tabletop role playing game was a surprisingly useful addition, so I hope you didn't mind that I added it in a lot. Folks, if you want to get your own parlay like this, you can get it using the link in the description. For now, thanks for listening. Thanks for the question. It was fun.